Good morning, people. This is another episode with Van Silk. Common Sense with Van Silk. Now, just because the topic is called Common Sense with Van Silk, I'm barely touching the surface of what this is going to be all about. But I want to talk about powerful people in the music industry. Well, how powerful was this person in the music industry? Today we're going to talk about Dick Clark. Yeah, Dick Clark, who's no longer here, but Dick Clark has left a legacy and was very powerful in the music industry in his heyday. As a little kid, I used to watch a show called American Bandstand, and Dick Clark was born and raised Brookville, New York, ended up in Mount Vernon. But Dick Clark seemed to got rid of his competitors early on, like Alan Freed and a lot of other people. Dick Clark was a motivator. But Dick Clark was also very, very, very nasty towards the record companies in the industry because he found a niche and became very powerful. When you had a show like American Bandstand, every Saturday you got the newest acts on. It was incredible back then in the 70s. But then, also along the way came Soul Train with Don Cornelius. But that's a whole nother subject. But American Bandstand became powerful because Dick Clark was the oldest, it was called the oldest teenager. Yeah, he was called the oldest teenager. And he was accepted and seemed like he ran the gamut. I used to hear things about him, about threatening artists, telling them if they did the Grammys, they can't do the American Music Awards, another show that came underneath the Dick Clark production. And I always thought the American Music Awards, a lot of awards was given because you made arrangement with the record labels at that time. If your artists come on here and perform with American Music Awards, we'll get them 2 or 3 awards. They make up these titles and everything. But the documentary I'm going to show about Dick Clark. I don't own the rights, but I'm on fair use to give you what it was about Dick Clark. Casey Kasem and all these guys that came after him was the product of what Dick Clark had said. A lot of people don't understand the power this man had. Rocking New Year's Eve, Dick Clark specials. And if I'm not wrong, I still think a lot of these shows, if it's still a Dick Clark production, you got to look at the credits. His company is still involved with a lot of things. His company was involved early on getting publishing rights of artists to get on his show and all this. That's how powerful he became in this industry. And, may he rest in peace, but a lot of people thought he might have been racist. There was times where the people that be on American Bandstand, you only have one black couple on the dance floor. And I used to look at that like, wow. But that was the time that we lived in. And I just want to bring to people's attention with common sense to say, hey, it is what it is. It was what it was. That was the era of the time that we lived in. And I hope a lot of people realize that time has changed, but we still have the same ideology about some people who still live this way, with the racist ways. And I'm going to bring up Soul Train real quick. What's called Soul Train, you did have a couple of different ethnic backgrounds on Soul Train. It might not have been a show where Caucasian was on, but it was definitely the minority ethnicity on there. But I just want to bring to the attention of the Dick Clark syndrome, how important it was to American music during that time, and the ins and out of what was going on with Dick Clark. But on this note, it's Common Sense with Van Silk, Dick Clark. Y'all sit back, watch, learn something, get to understand. No matter how much he might have smiled in front of us on TV, the word was he was the worst person to ever be around. But it's called show business. This is your brother Van Silk, Common Sense with Van Silk. Follow me on rumble.com, subscribe, and y'all have a blessed day. I'm out. America.
Dick Clark looked like America's sweetheart. Clean-cut, wholesome, the perfect host. But in 1960, during a private meeting with record executives, he said something so shocking that several co-stars walked out. They never came back to American Bandstand. The statement was caught on tape, buried for decades. It revealed Clark's true feelings about who belonged on his show and who didn't. This wasn't about music, this was about control. What he said changed everything. It destroyed friendships and ended careers. The truth will make you see his smile differently. Dick Clark was born on November 30th, 1929, in Bronxville, New York, and raised in Mount Vernon in a quiet home where his father worked for radio stations and his mother stayed at home. From early on, he was drawn to sound and speech. When he was 10, he had already decided he wanted to work in radio. He didn't wait for permission. He built a studio in his basement, using an old stove as a microphone and his dad's discarded scripts as cue cards. That small setup gave him a spark, and from there, he never looked back. But the smooth childhood he lived was shattered when he was 15. His older brother, Bradley, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, was killed during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He was only 22. Dick heard about it not from a formal notice, but from neighbors dropping off condolences. That pain never left him. It hardened something in him. From that point, it wasn't just about dreams. It became a duty to succeed. He became the only surviving son and felt the weight of that every time he walked through the house that used to echo with two voices and now had just one. In high school at A.B. Davis, he wasn't remarkable in the classroom, but the debate team lit him up. That's where he found rhythm in words and presence in silence. He practiced the craft of sounding confident, even when his hands were shaking. People started noticing him. He had this clean image, this soft-spoken, almost too good to be true charm that others trusted. By the time he graduated in 1947, he had already dipped his toes in radio, working in the mailroom at Run AM in Utica, New York. He was just 16 in 1945, but his ambition ran ahead of his age. At Run, he didn't just deliver letters, he paid attention. Every cue, every voice, every name on an envelope. And when the weatherman went on vacation, Clark stepped up. He read the weather live, clenching cue cards and calming his voice. His first on-air appearance wasn't glamorous, but it was real. That was all he needed to believe he belonged on a microphone. Bradley's shadow followed him, especially after the funeral. Losing a brother in war changed the way he looked at time. He was no longer afraid of failing. He was afraid of wasting a day. That fear drove him hard. He didn't party much. He worked on weekends, stayed after hours, and volunteered for shifts no one wanted. Radio wasn't just a path. It was his way of staying sane, staying sharp, and proving he could stand on his own without leaning on his father's title. His dad managed Run, and his uncle owned the place. But Clark didn't want favors. He even changed his on-air name to Dick Clay during his senior year in 1950, just to avoid being confused with his father. It wasn't about shame, it was about identity. He wanted to earn that name the hard way, not inherit it. He enrolled at Syracuse University in 1947 with a partial scholarship and picked advertising as a major with a radio minor. Tuition was about $400 a year, and even that was a stretch. So he took a job at Wolf AM for $1 an hour, working weekends, playing country music records, and reading news updates. By January 1951, he was hosting his own show called The Wolf Buckaroos, spinning records and crafting radio breaks with rhythm and personality. He also worked at Weir, the campus station, where he spent 4 years recording shows and building skills most students wouldn't touch until after graduation. All of it was hard work, but none of it felt like struggle to him. He loved it. He lived for the red light turning on in that tiny sound booth. Clark wasn't just a voice in a box. At Syracuse, he was also moving among crowds. As a member of Delta Kappa Epsilon, he threw sock hops and frat parties. He charged 50 cents per head, DJ'd the event himself, picked records, read the crowd, and built energy. These weren't just social gatherings, they were trial runs. Every party was a live audience, and every cheer or silence was feedback. He learned how to win a crowd without shouting. He learned when to pause, when to let the music speak, and those lessons would follow him straight into television. By 1951, Clark had offers. One of them was from a major ad agency. It was safe, well-paying, the kind of job most parents prayed their kids would get. But he said no. He had no backup plan, just a voice, a face, and a desire to be in broadcasting. His first post-college job was back at WKTV in Utica, hosting a country music show called Cactus Dick and the Santa Fe Riders. It was part forecast, part skit, part live performance, built for a rural farming audience. The pay was just $52.50 a week, and when Syracuse's When TV tried to poach him with better money, WKTV bumped him to $75 a week. He stayed. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was real. He handled everything from live weather reports to cowboy skits and kept a steady rhythm while cameras rolled. His practice hours were mounting, and the lens no longer felt foreign. His connection to his father still lingered, though. People whispered that his job came from family influence, and truthfully, it did. His dad managed Run. His uncle owned it. Doors opened that wouldn't have for others. Clark didn't deny that, but he also made it clear. He resented it. He wanted to be chosen because he was good, not because of bloodlines. That bitterness pushed him harder. It wasn't just ambition, it was pride, and it became his fuel when he packed his bags for Philadelphia. In 1952, at age 22, Clark joined WFIL Radio in Philadelphia. He earned just $35 a week spinning pop records in the afternoons. His apartment was small. His dinners were cheap. But he kept pushing. By 1954, he became the substitute host of the radio version of Bandstand, a teen dance show that was gaining traction. When Bob Horn, the original host of the TV version, was arrested for drunk driving and caught in a child pornography scandal, Clark stepped in. He was just 26. July 9, 1956, was his first day hosting the televised version. His voice steady, his hair combed, his tone friendly. He asked teens if the music made them want to move, had them rate songs from 1 to 100, and suddenly, something clicked. The audience grew from 5,000 to 20,000 a week. He brought in rules, too. Boys had to wear suits. Girls had to wear dresses. This gave the show a wholesome image that appealed to sponsors, but also excluded teens from poorer families or different backgrounds. Not everyone could afford to look the part. It was polished, but it came at a cost. Behind the camera, another story brewed. Clark had inherited Horn's pay-for-play system, known as payola. Record labels slipped gifts under the table, $100 watches, rare records, anything to get their songs airtime. In 1959, the FCC came knocking. Payola had become a national scandal. DJs and hosts were being exposed for manipulating charts and playlists. Clark was called before Congress. He admitted to receiving gifts, but denied ever taking cash. He avoided criminal charges by selling off his interests in music publishing and cooperating fully. He walked away bruised, but not broken. His public image took a hit, but not enough to end him. What truly cemented Clark's legacy was his grip on youth culture. He understood what made teens tick. Bandstand wasn't just a music show, it shaped dance trends, fashion statements, and language. He helped launch stars like Chubby Checker and the Supremes. The interactive format, where teens judged songs live, made audiences feel involved. Clark stood at the center of it all, clean-cut and calm, holding the culture in the palm of his hand. But those dress codes always lingered in the background. They looked innocent at first, just a rule to keep things neat. But over time, they revealed something darker. They kept some kids off the stage. Kids who danced just as well. Kids who couldn't afford the right outfit. Kids whose skin didn't match the network's unspoken standard. The bandstand opened doors for some, but locked others out. It started on August 5, 1957, when ABC took a local teen dance show and pushed it onto national television at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. It was called American Bandstand, and it had one thing nobody else had: Dick Clark. Young, clean-cut, camera-ready, and razor-sharp behind the scenes. By 1959, just 2 years later, the show had ballooned to 20 million viewers across the country. It was the #1 daytime program in America, and Clark was making $10,000 a week. That salary alone told you who held the power. Every episode was shot live from Philadelphia. Every song was lip-synced to avoid technical errors. And every decision about who got on air was made by Clark. If a new singer wanted to break through, they had to go through him. A single performance on that stage could turn a dusty record into a national #1 by the next week. The show wasn't just dancing. It was market research disguised as a game. The Rate a Record segment invited teens to rate songs from 35 to 98. Anything above 70 was seen as a potential hit. And between 1957 and 1964, nearly 70% of top 40 records had been pushed through this system. The most famous example was Chubby Checker's The Twist. On August 6, 1960, he performed it on Bandstand. By September, it had hit #1. Then it hit again 2 years later. No other song had ever done that. Clark even asked Checker to tone down the moves to make it family safe. Overnight, it wasn't just a hit, it was a national dance craze. Record sales for songs featured on Bandstand spiked by 30%. If you got on Clark's show, your odds of success were no longer a gamble. But Clark wasn't stopping at one show. He launched a Saturday primetime version called The Dick Clark Show in 1958. It aired until 1960 and featured acts like Frankie Avalon, whose contract Clark helped arrange. Behind the scenes, Clark signed deals with these performers. If they made money, so did he. Some were locked into royalty-sharing arrangements where Clark took 50%. In Fabian Fort's case, Clark gave him exposure and in return received half the royalties from his hits. Fabian got a small allowance. Clark made millions from publishing rights. These weren't one-off deals. This was a factory, a clean-cut, camera-friendly, safe idol machine built for advertisers. The darker truth was that black artists and edgier acts were pushed to the margins while Clark's white teen idols were polished and promoted. And then came the scandal. In late 1959, the House of Representatives began investigating payola, the illegal practice of accepting money or gifts in exchange for airplay. Clark became a target. The numbers were impossible to ignore. He had ownership stakes in 33 music companies. One example stood out. In 1957, Clark invested just $125 into Jamie Records, a struggling label. By 1959, Dwayne Eddy's surf rock hits had pushed that tiny stake into a $31,700 windfall. That's about $246,000 today. Clark told Congress, "I think the crime I have committed, if any, is that I made a great deal of money in a short time on little investment." He insisted there were no bribes, just smart business. But the fact that he played records from labels he partially owned raised questions that wouldn't go away. On May 2, 1960, he sat in front of Congress for 8 hours. He admitted he promoted records from companies where he held stakes, like Cap Records, where he owned 25%. Bobby Rydell's Wild One had been played 17 times on Bandstand in 1959 alone. The numbers weren't coincidences. They were strategies. Clark defended it all, saying he was simply using his experience and had divested his interests before the hearings. He insisted he'd never taken direct payola. Congress couldn't prove otherwise, but the fallout came anyway. Clark's longtime producer, Tony Mamarella, resigned under pressure after accepting $7,000 in gifts, including a fur stole for Clark's wife. ABC wanted to save Clark's face, so Mamarella became the scapegoat. That same week, Clark sold off $150,000 worth of music assets to avoid indictment. That would be about $1 million today. He later said, "The crime was making money too fast." ABC suspended Bandstand temporarily in 1960. When it returned, Clark was still host, but stripped of all music-related financial interests. Alan Freed, a rival DJ who had promoted black artists more heavily, wasn't so lucky. He was fired and blackballed. Clark kept his seat. That outcome didn't sit well with everyone. Even after the scandal faded, the scrutiny didn't. In 1961, Clark launched Dick Clark Productions to move into safer ground. Game shows, variety specials, and music award programs. But behind the scenes, suspicions lingered. Industry insiders whispered that nothing had changed. In 1969, J.J. Cale turned down a Bandstand appearance because he refused to lip-sync. He wasn't alone. Musicians started boycotting, arguing that the show valued profit and exposure more than performance. The resentment was real. There was another truth, too. One the cameras rarely showed. Clark claimed he integrated Bandstand in 1959. He featured black performers like Fats Domino. But the studio audience told a different story. Until 1964, it stayed nearly 99% white, even in a city like Philadelphia, where the black population was large and active. Black teens were quietly turned away at the door. Some tried out. Most were rejected. One of them, Dorothy Lynch, got in. She was harassed, taunted, and pushed out by the regular white dancers. Clark later said he didn't notice, but producers were enforcing rules behind the scenes. Only one black couple was allowed per show. Artists like Chuck Berry were invited but treated unequally. They were pushed to the back of the stage. Given less airtime, Clark reportedly told labels in 1960, "We keep it clean for the parents." That meant no close-ups of interracial dancing. That meant performances were filtered to protect the show's image, not the artist's integrity. Even when the show moved to California in the 1970s, black teens remained rare. Journalists in the 1980s exposed the truth. Clark's all-American image was built on systemic exclusion. Sponsors didn't want controversy, so Clark kept it clean. Clean meant white. Clark kept gambling. In 1963, he left Bandstand briefly to launch The Object Is, a game show where contestants swapped prizes for cash, sometimes walking away with $10,000 in one episode. It won 2 Emmys by 1964, but folded within the year. Then came Where the Action Is in 1965. Set near Malibu, it focused on surf rock and sunny beaches, chasing teen culture on location. It featured over 37 episodes, showcasing acts like the Supremes and Paul Revere and the Raiders. It was fun, but never a smash hit. Still, Clark kept experimenting and building. In 1967, he shocked the industry by buying TV stations with the profits he had built. KVOA in Tucson was just the start. the FCC launched investigations, warning that he might be forming a broadcast monopoly. By 1970, Clark was forced to scale back, but it was too late to stop the image. Clark wasn't just a host anymore, he was a mogul. He produced the American Music Awards starting in 1974. The first one was a hit, but rumors flew that the voting was rigged. Olivia Newton-John won 2 big awards. Insiders whispered it was all arranged. Clark's influence was too strong. Networks stayed quiet. The show made millions. The questions never stopped. He even tried acting. In 1960s, because they're young, he played a high school counselor. The movie made $1.2 million on a $1.8 million budget. Reviews were bad. He tried again in 1963 with The Young Doctors. Same result. By 1965, he gave up acting for good. His final gamble was Broadway. In 1980, he launched Beehive, a jukebox musical packed with 1960s hits. It made over $1 million in ticket sales, but was accused of whitewashing rock history. Critics said it erased the black roots of the genre. In 1972, New Year's Eve television was still ruled by slow-moving ballroom music and black tie formality. Guy Lombardo's CBS special had dominated the airwaves for years, but the youth of America had drifted far from those orchestra-heavy traditions. That's when Dick Clark stepped in with something sharper, faster, louder. On December 31st, 1972, the very first New Year's Rockin' Eve aired live from Times Square, with 3 Dog Night performing from the Queen Mary in Long Beach. Clark hosted from the heart of the action in New York, grinning through the cold while 25 million viewers tuned in. That night, he didn't just throw a party. He shifted the country's idea of what a New Year's celebration could be. Instead of tuxedos and champagne flutes, there was rock music and countdowns and glitter. The energy from Times Square poured into living rooms across America, and Clark's cool, laid-back presence became part of the ritual. 2 years later, the show moved to ABC and took on his full name. Now it was Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve, and the 1975 edition was headlined by the Beach Boys, giving it even more cultural firepower. But that night didn't go as smoothly as the scripts had promised. Out of nowhere, 30 nude protesters stormed the crowd near the stage. They were part of an art group called the American Family and started shouting slogans about freedom and peace. Clark could barely see what was happening through the chaos and lights, but the cameras caught it all live. Police dragged the protesters out while the broadcast kept rolling. Clark didn't panic. He just kept the show going. That moment burned itself into the history of the broadcast. It showed that Times Square wasn't a studio. It was raw, unpredictable, electric. By the time the calendar flipped to the 1980s, the show had settled into a rhythm that felt like tradition. Every year had its stars, and in 1980, it was Donna Summer's Hot Stuff that defined the night. Her song played loudly as confetti floated down, and the clock struck midnight. Clark's voice boomed through the cold, counting down like always. By now, the format was simple. Start around 10 p.m., run through some chart-topping performances, keep the crowd warm, and hit midnight with a bang. Ratings climbed year after year. Families watched together. College kids tuned in. Clark didn't change much because he didn't need to. People wanted that voice and that countdown. It felt permanent. In 1981, that sense of control nearly collapsed during the balloon drop. As the midnight moment approached, the net holding thousands of balloons failed. Instead of floating free, they tangled and collapsed right on top of the crew. Clark himself was caught underneath. The cameras didn't cut away. Viewers saw it unfold. But Clark just laughed, made a joke about being trapped in youth, and went on like nothing happened. That blooper became a classic moment. passed around as proof that anything could happen on live TV, and that Clark could make even the weirdest mishaps feel charming. The show's rise mirrored Clark's empire. By the 1990s, Rockin' Eve wasn't just a party. It was a business pulling in nearly $50 million a year. Advertisers paid top dollar to get a slice of those primetime slots. Clark's production company owned the rights, which meant every second on air lined his pockets. He expanded the format, brought in global segments, booked bigger acts, and turned the event into a must-watch juggernaut. There were more dancers, brighter graphics, louder songs, and the kind of New Year's celebration that didn't need to borrow tradition. It had become one. As 1999 approached, everything shifted toward the new millennium. ABC launched a special called 2000 Today and gave the anchor job to Peter Jennings. But Clark wasn't sidelined. He was sent into the Times Square crowds, bundled up and reporting live through the night. His speech was slower. Some viewers noticed. The rumors had already started swirling about his health. But he powered through, cracking jokes, grabbing interviews, and holding that familiar grin. He didn't miss that night, even if he wasn't in the center chair. He knew what it meant. It was the new millennium, and he was still standing under the ball drop. That show also marked the beginning of a long goodbye. Clark kept working, but his health was shifting. In private, he had been living with type 2 diabetes since 1994, something he didn't reveal publicly until a decade later. When he did, it was part of a national campaign to raise awareness. He had already begun experiencing foot complications, blood sugar crashes, and increased heart risks. He exercised daily, ate carefully, and stuck to his routines. But he knew the dangers. 2/3 of people with diabetes die from stroke or heart disease. He shared that fact in interviews, his voice quieter than it used to be, but still pushing forward. Then came the stroke. On December 6, 2004, just days before the next New Year's show, Clark suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and slurred his speech. He couldn't host. Regis Philbin stepped in. But Clark wasn't done. A year later, in 2005, he appeared on air again. His speech was halting. His body was slower. He looked visibly different. But he was there. He told viewers, "My speech is not perfect, but I'm getting there." He had to relearn everything: how to walk, how to talk, how to time his lines. Still, every New Year's Eve, he came back. From 2005 to 2011, he shared the screen with Ryan Seacrest, gradually handing over the reins, but never truly letting go. Behind the cameras, Dick Clark Productions was still a machine. By 2000, it had overseen over 7,500 hours of television. Clark was deeply involved in all of it. Scripts were micromanaged, lines were reviewed, entire segments were cut or reworked to keep things clean. Clark didn't want controversy, he wanted polish. He had built a reputation around consistency, and he protected it. Staff sometimes felt stifled, but they couldn't deny the results. Clark's methods worked. The shows ran on time. The ratings stayed high. His grip on the brand made it one of the most trusted names in live event television. But not everything he touched turned to gold. In 1990, he tried to revive Your Hit Parade, a nostalgic show built around musical countdowns. It flopped. Grunge was exploding, and the show's clean-cut pop tone felt out of step. After just one season, the audience dropped off and advertisers pulled out. The show vanished without ceremony. A similar fate met the other half, a talk show he co-hosted with Danny Bonaduce in 2001. It was meant to be a male version of The View, but it never found its voice. 18 months later, it was gone. Emmy nominations couldn't save it. The format felt flat. Even Clark's star power couldn't revive something that didn't resonate. His venture into home video also stirred up trouble. In 1985, he launched Dick Clark Video to distribute American Bandstand footage through Vestron. The VHS tapes sold well, but several former dancers sued the company, saying their images were used without permission. They hadn't signed off on their likenesses being packaged and sold. The lawsuits brought attention to the murky world of entertainment rights in the VHS boom and reminded everyone that even in the golden glow of nostalgia, there were real people with real grievances behind the scenes. Clark's stroke in 2004 shook the industry. It also accelerated the transition of his empire. By the time he passed away in 2012, he had already left much of the day-to-day operations to others. On April 18, 2012, he died from a massive heart attack at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, just one day after checking in for an outpatient procedure. He was 82. His wife and children were with him. His death certificate listed diabetes, heart disease, and prior stroke complications. He had been seen on television only weeks earlier, still working. When his estate was settled, it was valued at around $100 million. Months later, Dick Clark Productions was sold to a consortium that included Guggenheim Partners for around $370 to $385 million. The deal sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. That kind of valuation proved just how powerful the Clark brand had become. But the sale also brought scrutiny. Former employees and performers filed lawsuits alleging withheld residuals and unpaid compensation. Stagehands filed class action claims worth up to $400,000. Behind the glitz, there were wounds. The business wasn't always fair. Then came the questions about legacy. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Clark had been pulled into the payola scandals. He testified before Congress. He avoided the downfall that hit others, like Alan Freed, but only by divesting from several music-related holdings. Years later, critics accused him of benefiting from systems that excluded black artists. They said his role in Bandstand often erased the true roots of rock music. Interviews and archival footage revealed regrets from some performers who felt used. They said Clark's shows were more about selling his brand than supporting their careers. Even with all the success, Clark's story has edges. His smile made you feel safe. His countdown felt like home. But underneath the sparkle were deals, lawsuits, and power plays. He knew how to work the system. He made himself the face of celebration. And every December 31, as the ball dropped and the confetti rained down, millions saw that face and heard that voice, steady, warm, ageless.